try to add some links or email them so you can have access to some of those things. But as English majors, I always recommend picking up a hard copy, the 7th edition MLA Guide for Writers of Research, which of course is cited here. So if you want to get that, it's handy to have, you know. And I think with it comes access to the online version. You can buy the hard book, you get a code to access the online version, which has everything plus more examples. It's a pretty big, pretty handy resource. Yeah.
One more stylish issue is if we make a statement that's sort of a little bit blankety in terms of maybe it covers the whole text or a large portion of the text. How
do you set it?
How do you cite that? I know having asked the question whether it's probably not something you do a lot of, but
yeah.
But you might.
You might, absolutely. And MLA says you cite just the author's name. Right?
Okay.
So if you're saying, and it's tricky when you
Need to do it.
You say it in a sentence typically. Leo Marx argues, in Cheetah's Garden that the technology, interrupted a certain idealized version of the pastoral ideal, the pastoral sensibility, by distinguishing between the two kinds of pastorality. Make a blank statement about his text that you talked about. Leo Marx, it feels repetitive to put Marx in parentheses. In that case, I think you don't have to say anything.
Okay.
Right. Because you
covered it.
Yeah, and you'll have that in the works cited page, right? And that's just a general rule of thumb. The whole idea of being so inattentive about citation format is to give the reader no trouble in finding exactly where you got what you got, right? So that's why you alphabetize the works cited page. That's why you do all those things. So if it's clear, if it's standardized and clear enough to do that, then it's fine. So if you say Leo Marx's book, Machine in the Garden, your reader can kind of assume that that's going to be listed, and then they can find publication information, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Same with page numbers and all that. So if when in doubt, oversight, I guess is the good. Did I say rule of thumb a little bit ago?
You
Well, it's from my mom that I got in a conversation with her that I was reminded of that, and I said it the other day and I caught myself. Because it was the rule of thumb was the maximum width of the stick you could use to beat your wife, right?
It's in England.
Oh, politically incorrect.
Yeah.
That's why I don't get married or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Boyfriend wouldn't marry me.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
That's right. So,
need a rule of hair.
yeah.
There
you go.
I'm telling that.
I like that.
Okay, so maybe turning to this other sheet, we can cover even more of these issues if you have any lingering. So this quotation embedding worksheet, or guideline sheet, I guess, is just a little handy reference guide that I made to offer just a nice 4-step series of things to think about, or guidelines, when you're quoting and using evidence from especially scholarly research, right? And the 4 steps are simply introduce the source of your evidence, contextualize that evidence in your argument, be selective about what you quote, right? So the basic idea there is don't overquote. And lastly, embed quotations into your own syntax, right? And there's a word I like to use for that. A lot of people tend to want to drop in quotes. And so I talk about drop-in quotes as if you begin a sentence and end a sentence with no interruption of your own with a quotation mark, then you've got a drop-in quotation, right? And that interrupts the flow. The primary reason is interrupts the flow of your own writing. So the argument is sort of stopped because someone else is speaking for a minute without having been introduced. So I like to think about writing an essay as, in a sense, moderating a panel of other scholars, right? We talked a little bit about the scholarly conversation that a paper is supposed to participate in. So you think about a paper as sort of moderating a panel of these scholars. And so when each person is going to speak, you kind of introduce them, you gesture to them, and you sort of contextualize their contribution to the panel discussion in the context of the way you're organizing the ideas, right? And so when someone just interrupts and starts speaking, kind of jostles the whole flow out of its zone. Right? So I've got a couple examples, and we'll kind of read through here a bit, and we can see if we can make sense of that. So looking for number 1, where did you know, to introduce the source of evidence, simply say where you got it from, right? This will usually be the person who wrote the piece you're quoting, except in cases that Caitlin brought up where you're quoting someone else within someone else's writing, so that's another sort of sideline issue surrounding that you want to indicate typically when that's happening. But if it's Leo Marx, for example, introduce him and the work you're quoting, and if it's relevant, provide some very brief biographical info, 1 or 2 adjectives, to introduce him. So in Machine in the Garden, comma, American Studies critic Leo Marx argues, ... whatever these guys say. Yeah.
Is it fair to make any assumptions about the knowledge of, well, you're the reader, right? So in terms of overkill on introductions, right? Introducing Ralph Waldo Emerson, or is it just assumed knowledge that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically someone like Leo Marx is less well known, but Emerson is a mainstay, right? Wordsworth is pretty well known. Plato, ancient Greek philosopher. Wow. Yeah, we get it, right? So there's a little bit of a judgment call there. Again, usually in an academic setting, you wanna toe the line a little bit. You have to both indicate that you trust your reader to know something, but also be sure that in the event that someone else is reading, they get it too. And that's why you don't want to overkill. You know, I've had a lot of undergrads will write Machine in the Garden, American Studies critic employed at Harvard University. You know, and it's like, well, American Studies critic is fine, and not even to no stuffy professor or stuffy scholar will be offended by you saying, reminding them that he's an American Studies critic or whatever. And sometimes that actually you can situate your reading in that context that way as well. Right? So depending on what adjectives you use to describe someone's biography or their situation in the conversation, you can kind of show how you're reading that person. Right? I'm thinking, so to use a really bad example, you could say post-colonial critic or post-colonial theorist Edward Said argues versus, you know, half Arab, half American scholar Edward Said argues, right? That's a different situation of his position in the conversation. Does that make sense? Or Oriental, you know, Edward Said, then you're in trouble. So you have this kind of, even those tiny little moves, I guess the point is, are valuable in some sense. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I just wanted to make sure there was some subjectivity in terms of the, like you said, the mainstays like Emerson or Wordsworth, you can kind of assume knowledge.
And it's also a sort of style flourish to thinking of Emerson, where it's you know, the Concord Sage, that's not his nickname, but the Concord Sage, Ralph Waldo Emerson says that it's a little bit of a flourish. You can demonstrate your savvy that way, you know, if you want to make that one. But typically, the big names you don't have to do too much with. Middle range critics you might want to think about. Yeah, is that a thought?
Yeah, sort of along the same lines. What if I want to make sort of a statement that's really almost too general to really cite, like say a statement about a school of thought or something? Because I remember I remember doing a paper a couple quarters ago where I had to make a statement about what modernism was, and having to. I think I cited some other, you know, teacher's website because I didn't know. I mean, I knew what I was trying. I know what I wanted to say about it, but I didn't. You know, I don't want. You know, I want to say modernists believe this.
Yeah.
But I really, you can't say that.
Yeah.
Especially
those
if I believe.
Those are hard. Those are really hard. If you're reasonably confident that it's your opinion, right, about a large scale of school of thought, like you say, like that, you don't need to necessarily cite anyone. If you do a little bit of research and say, oh, well, here's a good way to put it, right? Do that, right, and cite someone. If in your research you find that everyone says the same thing, or a bunch of people say the same thing, you can be reasonably confident that that's common knowledge in a certain sense. That there's one person that has kind of citability privileges, right, about that idea. Does that make sense? So something like modernism, there's a lot of, and that's the other way to do it, is to acknowledge the multiplicity of the problem, right? Scholars don't agree on what this thing is, right? So there are many different opinions, but for the purposes of my essay, this is what it means. That kind of move can sidestep that issue. Even for eco-criticism is a good example of that. this, Lawrence Buell says this, right? William Cronin has this approach. I think all those things are valid, but I'd rather that finagle all these different opinions into a general sense of things like that without having to cite anyone in particular. Does that make sense? So it's, again, judgment call. Okay, let's keep moving down the list. So introduce the evidence, name the book, name the writer, if you need to, a little bit of biographical information. A reminder, and you don't need it, I'm sure, but once you introduce a writer, Leo Marx, you could use Marx there on out, unless you start bringing Carl into the equation, in which case you'll have to change, you have to be specific about that. Which actually raises a good issue. In citations, in this case, since we have more than one, you would say Marx K, L, A1, or whatever, like that, versus Marx K, whatever, yeah.
What about, I have an article by Troyer, and so if I'm citing that and the book, which, how do
In
I
that case,
differentiate?
in that case, you would do, like that. Troyer, you would do that, and usually, again, it has to do with, can your reader look at that citation, turn to your works cited, and find exactly what they're looking for, right? So in this case, you would say Troyer, and you can usually, for long titles like the translation of Dr. Apelles, you can just shorten them with a good judgment call. And there's no standardization for that, but the translation will get your reader to that moment. Versus, say, I don't know, do you remember the title of the article?
Find it real quick.
So the translation, the words, the translation would be in that text. This would
Yeah,
be-
exactly. Yep. And if it's an essay, you know,
Reading culture.
and in that case, with 2 words, you can either just do reading or you can do both. You know, and again, it's not very visible, sorry, but Troyer, comma, quotes, reading culture, space, no punctuation again, and space 3 or whatever page number. And so in that case, you would just indicate it in the citation, unless you mention it in the sentence, right? So if you say, Troyer says in the translation Dr. writes in the translation of Dr. Apelles, Dr. Apelles is trying to find himself, why? And then you can just do the page number versus or reading culture or using reading culture guide. Maybe?
I used a literature, the peer review text, and then they quoted off the Plato, and it's in the journal. So how
Okay.
do you cite that and use that quote that he
Use the quote that
the
the journal writer
Right, yeah,
is quoting Plato.
right.
You would do it like this, right?
Same thing.
Same thing. So
Okay.
change the words.
Oh, okay.
Plato, probably said, whatever, writes, text, quoted in, whatever your author is. Yeah, so this is your magical trick. And QTD is the abbreviation. I'm not like, use it. Yeah.
Well, if you would quote a group of students masquerading as Karl Marx.
Oh, not there. Oh, now we're in the philosophy element. I like that. But it gets even more thorny when you also have to acknowledge that it's yourself as the student masquerading as Karl Marx. Yeah, that's really true. That's tricky. I don't have the answer. So moving along, introduce the evidence, name the text, the writer, and then contextualize it. How does it fit into your argument? What should your readers see in that piece of evidence? What kind of evidence is it? Why should your reader care about it? You don't have to answer all those questions, obviously, but depending on where you're at in your argument, you want to indicate, purposefully, what's this quotation doing here? Why have you chosen this thing to say at this point, right? Note too when your reader needs to know more about where your quotation is coming from. You might need to summarize the larger argument from which a quotation is taken. It's a lot of, as you can tell, a lot of arguments are complex, right? Thinking about Cronin, he quotes a lot of old biblical passages in support of a certain kind of idea of wilderness that he doesn't, in the article, ultimately agree with, right? But if you quoted him out of context in your essay, your reader's not going to know that he's saying that ironically, or he's ultimately trying to critique that way of thinking about wilderness or whatever, right? So in that case, you want to indicate the larger context in which a quotation appears in the text that it came from. So an example of that kind of summarial moment might be the example I have there. My critique here emerges out of a shared suspicion of what Marx calls the sentimental pastoral, which is, and I quote a little bit, an expression less of thought than a feeling that manifests in numerous arenas in American culture, like a flight from the city toward the suburbs, or the tendency to idealize rural ways. And you can go on from there and quote something meaningful, right? Also, be selective. Step 3, choose the pieces of evidence you quote carefully. Quote only what is relevant to your argument so your reader doesn't get bogged down in sifting through too much of someone else's writing. And a lot of writers introduce things, their arguments also have transitions in them, right? You don't need to quote the transitions, you just want to quote the juice, right? Sometimes this means only quoting a few words and paraphrasing the rest. And a reminder also that anytime you paraphrase, you still need to cite. Right? So even if you don't quote at all, but you paraphrase someone's argument in all your own words, you still got to cite where that's coming from. So example of too much info, too much quotation might be, Leo Marx writes, comma, quote, the mass media cater to a mawkish taste for retreat into the primitive or rural felicity exemplified by TV westerns and Norman Rockwell magazine covers. Perhaps the most convincing testimony of the continuing appeal of the bucolic is supplied by advertising copywriters. A favorite strategy, validated by marketing research, assumes that Americans are most likely to buy the cigarettes, beer, and automobiles they can associate with a rustic setting, end quote. Right? Everything's done right. I've embedded in my own context or my own syntax, right? I've introduced the writer there, but there's just way too much kind of info, bogging down the flow there. Versus something that's more selective, citing television westerns, Norman Rockwell paintings, and ads for cigarettes, beer, and automobiles. Leo Marx suggests that the continuing appeal of the bucolic for American consumers is bolstered by marketing campaigns that align their products with the images of the rustic setting. Right? Just a couple of key words here and there are directly quoted, and the rest is kind of paraphrased and situated. And you can save yourself a lot of time and save your reader, or save yourself a lot of space and save your reader a lot of time thinking, right? By doing that kind of condensed paraphrase. And then lastly, as I mentioned, embed quotations in your own syntax. So I just have an example there of a drop-in versus an embedded quotation. Marx's distinction between his two pastorals, this is the drop-in example, offers a way to think about how nature and technology interact in American culture. A fine sentence, right? Period. The next sentence is a drop-in. Quote, what possible bearing can the urge to idealize a simple rural environment have upon the lives men lead in an intricately organized, urban, industrial, nuclear-armed society? End quote. He argues that there is both a popular and sentimental, pastoral, and an imaginative and complex one. That second sentence sort of throws off the vibe of the whole passage in a way, because the question sort of comes out of nowhere in a sense, but you can still use it by doing something like the next example. Embedded would look like this. In order to offer ways to think through the relationship between nature and technology, Marx asks, quote, what possible bearing can the urge to idealize a simple rural environment have upon the lives men lead in an intricately organized, urban, industrial, nuclear-armed society, end quote. His response to that question allows him to distinguish, et cetera, et cetera. Note there, too, that I have both Marx asks, comma, capital letter what, right, since that clause introduces the quotation as a complete sentence, and also specialized ending punctuation there, question mark, end quote, parenthetical 5, period. All sorts of nice little examples built in there. So does that all make sense, this little guide? Yeah. What I wanted to do is use this guide as something to help us look through the essays we have. How many people feel like it would be productive to do a full sort of critique of what you have written so far? Because I don't want to force a square peg to a round hole here. So maybe we could use our time elsewise. Let's see what else we might do.
just real quickly, I got a question about biographical information.
Yeah,
There's a couple of just short little blurbs that are actually word for word from Troyer's biographical information at the end of Appellee's.
oh,
I
okay,
need to cite those.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's a good question. I probably don't if, number one, you should research if they're still accurate, right? That's the first thing, if you can find out whether or not they're still accurate, which, because I think, what does it say in the back of Appellee's?
Oh, it just talks about them being a jib away from the lake preservation.
I guess that's not gonna change.
That probably doesn't change. What else?
But I know that he's
Where he
no
lives.
longer at Minnesota, he's
Oh.
in LA,
Okay,
right?
that's important, all right.
That's something we know. But I guess generally speaking, I would just try to use as many of your own words as possible. Because it's factual knowledge. You know, the editor of that edition of Appellee has some sort of primacy over that phrase, or that information. But they did write it in that way, so you might just consider paraphrasing it all.
Okay.
Getting that information in your own words. And then I don't know. Say that again?
You can like him on Facebook.
Yeah.
That's what I did today.
I had another question too on a couple of your paragraphs where you have multiple embedded quotes, like the very last one. If each one of those quotes is on a different page number, would you put different page numbers following each one of those quotes?
Yeah.
And if you don't,
Yeah.
are we to assume that those all came from 5? Or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Right. That's exactly right. Which brings me to another point. If you end a quotation, I don't have any good examples here, but if you end a quotation before a sentence is over and use a comma, say here, you know, and then start writing again. If this is your own commentary, this is correct, right? You would cite. So what I'm trying to get at is cite, include the parenthetical citation where where the person you're quoting, where their thinking ends and your thinking begins, right? So if you were to say, Plato writes, or let's see, Marx writes that the sentimental pastoral is prevalent, but it's hard to define, and then you quote him on that point, and then you say, but I think that he, in 2012, something else is happening and his sentimental pastoral no longer applies, right? If you put the citation at the end of that sentence, then it indicates that that's his thinking, right? So you want to put that parenthetical before you start commenting on the relevance of his idea. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't know if it's worth writing it down. Is that clear? What I mean by that? Ish.
Things to do right now, maybe.
Oh no.
I'm really tired.
Oh, so it's not.
Yeah, it's not you.
It's not necessarily me.
No.
If it was. Does that make sense? Basically, they're cite where their thinking ends and your thinking begins, even if it's in the middle of the sentence. It's a good question. There. Anything else about that? Yeah.
If you're quoting from a poem and you're quoting from multiple places because it's long enough to have multiple lines. Do you, I guess, with the end of each quotation mark, you indicate which line it's from, as opposed to the entire,
Yeah.
the entire section?
No. Let me think here. What do I do on this one? This kind of
As
is
opposed to,
specific, yeah.
as opposed to what you do, which is an entire chunk and it's lines.
Yeah. What I would do, and this is kind of an older version, it depends on what's happening in your essay or what you're doing with the poetry. In this case, if I were to write this guide today, I edited it today, but if I were to rewrite it, I would cite Bishop by page number there, right? Because unless you're dealing with a single poem and you're thinking specifically of where those things fall in the poem, like lines matter more, I guess, for epic poems and longer, Aeneid or Beowulf or something like that, where you want to indicate where in the poem this stuff falls, right? For for a short poem like this, it's probably best, since we have the page numbers and we're citing from that text, it's best to just cite that page. So I should better here, because we're not dealing with poems like that. So for something like that, if you have a whole bunch of passages, all from page 72 or whatever, 72 for all of them.
Okay. And if that's the case and it's all in one paragraph, I can just take the two.
Yeah.
Even if I'm including my own opinions in that paragraph? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah,
maybe
it's a
that's too
weird-
clunky.
No, that's a weird exception, but yeah, in that case, you
Like, line quoting this, which signifies that, and then here's another quote, and here's another quote, and then at the end, page 4.
And generally speaking too, if you're dealing with one person's text and it all is gonna, in a single paragraph, and it all comes from multiple places on a single page, for example, you can also do that even if you intersperse your own commentaries. You don't need to cite. If you're sticking with the same text, you don't need to cite. That's kind of the exception to the rule I just insisted on. You don't need to cite it every time, right? Typically, it's if you're switching back and forth between sources in a paragraph or something, or in a section of commentary where you're commenting on someone's source and you're talking about someone else, and then moving back and forth between a primary and secondary text, for example. Then you want to cite. You want to make really clear where your thinking begins and theirs ends. Otherwise, if you are doing a lot of work with one section of a critic's text or something like that, and you're making comments in between there, the best thing to do is just indicate in the text where you're speaking and where they're not. And you don't have to cite it every time. Man, there's a lot to- I don't know, no one's going to remember all of this. But they're good things to rattle around with. Yeah. Okay, one last thing I want to do, I guess, since you're all here, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of sense level activity instead of have a full critique. And I might mandate some sort of online critique this weekend or something. I don't know. Quarter ends pretty quick, doesn't it?
I thought my last day was the 8th.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's not.
Yeah.
I kind of had that in my head for a while too. But what I'm passing out now, speaking of the last week of class, is a little blurb or an extended blurb about the conference that we're going to have in lieu of the final exam, right? And I realized I made a miss, or I guess it's better to say a non-calculation, in thinking about this final exam. We have 23 people in here. We have a 2-hour slot for a final exam. There's no way each of you is going to talk for 8 to 10 minutes, right? So this is both a blessing and a curse that I'm about to bestow upon you. Instead of 8 to 10 minutes, I need you to fashion a conference presentation of your scholarly essay in a 5-minute talk, right? It's a blessing because it's only 5 minutes. It's a curse because that's hard as hell, right? To cut a 6-page essay into 5 minutes. And I have a note at the bottom to remind you, for those that don't do a lot of speaking from a page, about 2 minutes it takes to read a single page of double-spaced text. So if you have a 6-page essay and you want to make it into a 5-minute speakable version, you want to get that down to about 2.5 pages or so. So about 2 minutes a page is a typical comfortable reading pace, something about like what I'm speaking now. If I slow down my Andy Meyer typical coffeeed up voice and try to speak somewhat clearly and slowly and really consider my words and talk about at this rate, I'd get through a page in about 2 minutes. So keep that in mind. So I just want to go through this handout just so I'm sure you've read it all. Yeah, interrupt anything.
Really quickly, can we import a podium for
that?
that?
You know, that's actually not a bad idea.
Like having.
Yeah, I do too.
So I don't
Yeah,
have to-
and I like standing, and that's typically what happens at a conference if you're going to speak, you stand up. So I'll see what I can do about getting
Right.
a little podium,
Yeah.
a lectern of some kind.
Yeah. Like the whole days or anything.
Yeah. Some of the classrooms around here even have kind of tabletop ones that work fairly well. They just set a little podium thing. I think there's actually one upstairs because I taught last quarter.
It's like 2:43, 42.
Yeah.
Or
You don't know where one is. perfect. So we'll make sure something like that is in here. And nevertheless, I'm gonna come early enough on what will be a week from next Tuesday.
When's the last day of class?
That's it. Well, the last day of class is a week from today. We don't have class Monday, which is why some of this is everything kind of, that last Memorial Day just screws up the whole thing. But then the Tuesday after Memorial Day, the 29th, a week after that, so I don't know what the date is.
The 29th of May?
Is the week before the last day of class is terrible.
Here, you wanna do that?
Yeah, I guess I should say the last day of class is May 30th, the Wednesday, right? Of class official, and then our final exam, which is actually going to be our miniature conference, is
June 4th.
June 4th, Tuesday, right?
Monday.
Monday.
Monday, is it
And
a
it
Monday?
says 8:30 to 10:20 PM.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah, but we'll
Okay.
make it 10, probably 35. I really don't think there's another final after, in here after that. So, as long as people, and if people have to leave, you know, we'll make exceptions for that.
Since my graduation is on the 6th, and
Yeah,
I
right,
didn't sign up because I had
yeah.
oh,
So, June 4th, is that written? I thought for sure it was on a Tuesday.
Tuesday's a,
Tuesday the 5th.
Tuesday's the 5th.
When is 4th?
Okay.
yeah,
You have to tomorrow, so
I do.
I think so. General Friday.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
It wasn't even good you're cutting me out.
Oh, maybe.
I don't know, all this makes me think it's okay, I don't have to go. I don't care.
so whatever the case is, whatever day that is, I'll have to double check here on my UW thing. But that day, we'll have our 2-hour conference and we'll buzz through 5-minute presentations one after the other. And then if we're right on the money, 5 minutes each time, that will give us 115 minutes, and we have about 120. So a tiny bit of leeway. But unfortunately, the part that bumps me out is in my grander schemes. Before the quarter started, I had the idea that we would have time for quite a little bit of question and answer, one question or so, 1 or 2 questions from the audience kind of thing, but we might have to cut our losses and just have a nice polished 5-minute talk. So let me put it this way. Writing an academic essay that seriously, thoughtfully, and thoroughly engages an issue of academic concern is well and good, and it is an important critical practice. That's the name of our course. But reading, thinking, and writing primarily for your own eyes can be a rather lonely practice, and its rewards are not always immediately felt. The academic conference, then, provides a venue that brings the lonely practice of scholarship to life. A conference is a place where you get to offer your ideas to others who share your concerns and who are engaged with the same or similar issues. The conversations that emerge from formally sharing your work with other scholars can be quite rewarding. They can reveal ways of thinking you haven't considered. They can reveal limitations of your own arguments that you may not have realized. They can shore up your confidence in an idea or issue that you're excited about. They can create connections and relationships that deepen your own thought and your engagement with scholarship, and by extension, your engagement with your various living and cultural environments.
You missed out on a great career in marketing.
I'm about to turn and make a living. We're right next to Packers. Sidle over to a business school. But with these benefits, we can all put the marketing language here, right? But with these benefits comes a little responsibility. The people in the room at a given conference panel are there on good faith. They trust that you'll offer them something worth thinking about, so part of the challenge of a conference presentation is making that thing as clear and compelling as possible. So you want your listeners, and I like to think of it this way, you want your listeners to do 3 things. 1, listen to you thoughtfully. 2, understand what you're saying. And 3, remember what you said so they can take it to heart and mind. Right? In a conference setting, few listeners, however academically inclined, will care or be able to listen effectively to a written academic paper read aloud as it was initially written. Right? So ideally, we're writing more complexly than we would speak in a certain sense, right? In an academic setting. So you have the luxury to sort of really string together complex ideas and complex sentences, right? But in speaking, that's a harder thing to do effectively. It's hard for listeners, even if they're brilliant, to really catch up or to keep up with your thinking. The syntax and argumentation in a written essay is often too complex for listeners to grasp in one hearing. And that's the other thing to think about. You have one hearing. An essay you can go back and read over and over and over till you get it, right? A speech, you have to listen to it to make sure you're right there. Thus, in order to engage your audience, you'll usually want the oral version of your written work to be somewhat simplified in its language and argumentation. If you have a complex, multifaceted argument, you might want to consider ways to distill it into a few key points that are easy to paraphrase. And you might consider breaking up the language throughout the essay into more digestible chunks, changing long, complex sentences, for example, into several shorter ones. Lastly, you will want to carefully select which pieces of evidence you want to present in support of your argument. You won't be able to share all the passages, the big thing that I struggle with when I do conferences. You won't be able to share all the passages you analyzed in your written essay, nor all the evidence from scholarly research, so pick and choose the juiciest morsels and present them neatly for your listeners. I always struggle because I want to share everything. I'm really excited about every piece of evidence I have. I get it out there and I can't. I go over time and then my whole argument's lost, right? So there's this kind of really weird practice of, as I say just below, letting go that you have to get used to. As I say, it can be really difficult to reduce a complex essay to a digestible but still complex talk. Part of the skill needed for the practice is choosing what to include and what to leave out and how to articulate your thinking clearly. In a sense, it's learning how to let go, especially for the sake of clarity and memorability. So again, 5 minutes you'll have. So you can either reduce your 6 to 8 page scholarly essay to an oral version of the essay and read it to the audience, which is when I personally go to conferences, that's typically what I do. So I want to make sure that I have everything there. Or if you feel like you enjoy or are more natural extemporaneous speaking, just be sure you know your essay well enough to articulate your argument and evidence extemporaneously. Typically you'll have note cards or some sort of note device. But in order to get away with that and do it in 5 minutes effectively, you really want to make sure you know your stuff. You want to be really intimate with your own paper. But whichever mode you choose, you have to practice your presentation to ensure that you do not go over time. So please, please, please do this aloud to a roommate, a housemate, a partner, over and over until you make sure it's right under 5 minutes or right there. Whichever one you choose, you have to practice. Time will be strictly kept, and you will be rudely cut off when you're allotted 5 minutes or so, there will be a note, I'll hold up a 1 minute warning kind of thing on the day of. But generally speaking, you really want to be sure that you don't go over 5.
I was just saying that one template that you provided that was used to formulate the essay proposal,
Yeah.
if you actually take that and sort of PowerPointify it, I mean, it seems like that would be a good device for presentations, because you could talk about what attracted you to the material, what risks did you have to address, why is it relevant in the modern context, like so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So in that sense, giving a paper or giving a conference version of a complex essay is like an ex post facto proposal, right? You have the same kind of thinking that goes into that. That's a really good way to think about it. Yeah, that's something that would totally be a legit way to do it. And that's the other thing. If you do want to use some sort of presentation software like PowerPoint, feel free. I hate PowerPoint, but it's definitely a useful tool, and I can see its value. And I also think, I'm a visual person, but I'm not necessarily a visual learner all the time. Right? I love just listening to words, but I understand that some people really like to have, or need to have a visual thing, or some sort of indicator. So I won't grade you harshly if you choose to use something like PowerPoint. Sylvie, I'll also create I'll hand it out, I think, next class period, so a week from today, a rubric in advance of that date, so you know how all the values talks. No. Yeah, the paper is 30. And then the conference is another 15. So they're kind of separately measured. So 45 altogether. So yeah, not 60. You don't have to spend that much.
Oh yeah, my started over.
And you do have, Memorial Day is annoying, but it does mean you have a full week to prepare these things. Yeah. And I will try to be as available as possible. I am going to be on campus a little bit tomorrow, so if anyone is around in the afternoon or even early evening, I'll be glad to stop by and send me an email. Interested in that to have, since we didn't get much of a peer review workshop today. That's frowned on. It looked like you were pining for a workshop.
No.
And I'll also try to be available by email too, as much as possible, over the next few days. So I'm moving, ideally, this weekend, so, I'll be, have some things to do. 24 hours will be the ideal, turnaround time for me. What do you think? So it's 8 o'clock. I wanted to do some sentence level stuff. Does everyone have something written down here today? Yeah, at least? Why don't we do this? And this is kind of a version of what I had planned anyway. That wasn't in my initial plan supposed to take nearly that long, but that was, to me, those sometimes moments where we entertain a lot of persnickety formal questions can be useful, so hopefully that's useful. But I do want to do some sentence stuff. So does everyone have the writing issues worksheet, or sort of sheet that I handed out a while back? Remove all the passive voice stuff and everything like that. Is that in your heads?
This guy?
No, it's the list with some of the examples of passive voice. What's that? And notification and, wordiness.
I think they're by my computer.
Okay, fair enough. But if some of those things are in your head, what I want you to do is exchange what you have with someone. And I want, oh shoot, I forgot to bring this.